Am I wrong for kicking my mum out of the car after she slapped me while I was driving? It was a quiet morning when I set out with my mom and little brother. I'm 21, my mum's 39, and my brother is just 5, a little bundle of energy who sat in the back seat with his tablet. The plan was simple: run a few errands together, nothing special. Driving has never been my favorite thing, but when it's for family, I try not to complain. The thing is, my mom has this habit. Whenever I'm driving her somewhere, she doesn't give clear directions. Instead of saying turn left or go straight, she'll point vaguely or say something like that way. It's frustrating, especially when I'm trying to focus on the road and avoid making mistakes. I've told her before how much it stresses me out, but she brushes it off, saying I'm overthinking. As I started the car, I already felt the familiar tension building. She'd tell me where to go, but I knew her instructions wouldn't be straightforward. I took a deep breath and focused on staying calm. My little brother, oblivious to everything, hummed along to a song from his tablet. We pulled out of the driveway, and I felt the familiar sense of responsibility settle in. Being behind the wheel meant I was in charge of everyone's safety, and that was no small weight to carry. My mum started giving her usual vague instructions, and I clenched the steering wheel a little tighter. I reminded myself to keep it together. This was just another drive like any other, or so I thought. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The air felt heavy, like a subtle pressure building between us. Driving with my mum has always been a mixed bag. She and I have a complicated relationship, close in some ways, but often strained by little disagreements. She likes to be in control and I like clarity, especially when I'm driving. Our differences often lead to these tense car rides where I try my best to stay patient, but it's hard when I feel like I'm being set up to fail. In the back seat, my little brother was his usual cheerful self. At 5 years old, he didn't have a care in the world. His tablet was blasting a kid's show at a low volume, keeping him entertained. He didn't seem to notice the sharp tone creeping into my mum's voice or the stiffness in my posture. For him, this was just another ride. My mum, on the other hand, was already in her element, giving directions the way she always does, vague, hurried, and entirely unhelpful. "Go there," she said, pointing as if I could somehow see through her hand. I glanced at the intersection ahead, unsure which lane she wanted me in. "Where exactly?" I asked, my voice calm but tight. She sighed, as if I was the one making things difficult. "There, why do you make everything so hard?" This was how it always went. I didn't want to argue, especially not with my little brother sitting right there, but the irritation in her tone was like sandpaper against my nerves. I felt my grip on the steering wheel tighten as I tried to decipher her meaning. In these moments, it felt like there was no winning. If I questioned her directions, she'd call me difficult. If I made a mistake, she'd blame me for not paying attention. It wasn't even about the driving anymore. It was about the dynamic between us, the way she seemed to push, and the way I inevitably pushed back. Still, I told myself to stay calm. My brother didn't need to see us fight, and the last thing I wanted was for this drive to turn into yet another family argument. We'd barely made it out of the neighborhood when the tension started to bubble over. The first few minutes of the drive were uneventful, but the atmosphere in the car was already heavy. My mum's directions were vague as usual. "Turn up there," she said, motioning with her hand. I glanced at the road ahead, trying to figure out which turn she meant. "Which one, Mum? The next street or the one after that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. I didn't want this to escalate, but her instructions were like a riddle with no answer. She rolled her eyes dramatically, as if my question were ridiculous. "Just go that way," she snapped, pointing again. I sighed and tried to make a decision quickly, my frustration simmering under the surface. In the back seat, my little brother was blissfully unaware of the tension up front. He hummed along to the theme song of his favorite cartoon, swinging his legs and occasionally tapping his shoes against the seat. I envied his ability to tune everything out. I made the turn, but it wasn't the one she meant. Almost immediately, she let out a sharp, exasperated sound. "You weren't paying attention. Now we're going the wrong way," she scolded, her voice rising. I felt my chest tighten. I was already trying my best, and her reaction only made it harder to stay calm. "I can't read your mind, Mom," I said, glancing at her briefly before focusing back on the road. "If you just told me where to go, this wouldn't happen." That was all it took to light the fuse. Her voice got louder, her frustration spilling out, and I knew we were heading straight into another argument. I gritted my teeth and kept driving, trying to focus on the road ahead. The argument didn't take long to escalate. I'd made a wrong turn, but the way my mum reacted made it feel like I'd done something much worse. "Do you ever listen? I told you to go the other way," she said, her tone sharp and biting. Her words hit like darts, each one adding to the stress I was already feeling. I tightened my grip on the wheel and glanced at the GPS on my phone, hoping I could correct the mistake quickly. "I'm trying, Mum," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "But I need clear directions. Just saying that way doesn't help." That only seemed to irritate her more. She huffed loudly, throwing her hands up in frustration. "Why do you always have to argue? You never just do what I say." I bit back my immediate response, knowing it would only make things worse. The car felt smaller with every passing second, the tension pressing in from all sides. My little brother's laughter from the back seat felt oddly out of place now, a cheerful soundtrack to an increasingly heated moment. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He seemed oblivious, still engrossed in whatever was happening on his tablet. For a brief second, I felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't what he should be hearing. But before I could even process that thought, my mum's voice cut through again. "Turn around," she snapped. "Now we're going to be late because of you." My heart was pounding, my jaw clenched tight. I wanted to stay calm, to keep the situation from spiraling further, but her tone, her words, the constant tension, it was all pushing me to my limit. Still, I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in the frustration that was bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "Mom," I started, keeping my voice as even as I could, "I just need you to tell me exactly where to go. Not point, not say that way, but tell me, left, right, or straight, that's all I'm asking." She turned to face me, her eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Excuse me? I've been giving you directions. You're the one who doesn't listen." Her voice was louder now, her words sharp enough to slice through any hope of a calm conversation. I exhaled slowly, counting to 3 in my head before responding. "I'm not trying to argue with you," I said carefully, though I could hear the strain in my own voice. "I just need to focus on driving, and the way you're giving directions is making it harder." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, so now it's my fault? I'm the problem here?" I glanced at her briefly, trying to read her expression. The mix of anger and disbelief on her face was almost enough to make me back down, but I knew I had to stand my ground. "I'm not saying it's your fault, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But we're both in the car and we need to work together. I'm driving and I need your help to do that safely." Her response was immediate and cutting. "You're unbelievable. Always so sensitive, always making everything harder than it needs to be." In the back seat, my little brother's tablet paused for a moment, and I saw his curious eyes flick between us in the rearview mirror. My stomach tightened. I hated that he was seeing this, hearing this. I hated that I couldn't seem to keep the peace. "Let's just get where we're going," I said finally, my voice low and resigned. I didn't want to fight, but I could feel the heat rising in the car, a tension I couldn't shake. And I had a sinking feeling this wasn't over yet. The silence in the car didn't last long. My mom wasn't one to let things go easily, especially when she thought she was right. Her voice cut through the quiet, sharp and insistent. "You're so disrespectful sometimes. You don't appreciate anything I do for you." I clenched the steering wheel, staring at the road ahead, trying not to respond. I knew that anything I said now would only escalate things further. My heart was already pounding, the stress of driving under this pressure making it hard to think straight. "Are you even listening to me?" she snapped. Her tone was accusatory, and I felt the frustration rising in my chest. "You always act like this, like you know better than everyone else." "Mom, I'm trying to drive," I said through gritted teeth, my voice tense but controlled. "Can we talk about this later?" That was when it happened. Out of nowhere, her hand shot out and she slapped me on the back of the head. It wasn't hard enough to hurt, but it was enough to shock me. My hands jerked slightly on the wheel, and for a split second, the car swerved. "Mom, what the hell?" I yelled, my voice breaking with anger and disbelief. I pulled the car back under control, my heart racing from the sudden jolt of adrenaline. "Don't you dare talk to me like that!" She shouted back, her face flushed with anger. But all I could think about was how dangerous that moment had been, how her slap had almost caused me to lose control of the car. My little brother, startled, looked up from his tablet, his eyes wide. I knew I couldn't let this go. She had crossed a line, one that I wasn't sure could be walked back. The car was filled with a deafening silence for a moment after the slap. My hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel, not from fear but from a mix of anger, disbelief and adrenaline. My mind was racing, replaying what had just happened. She had slapped me while I was driving, a move that could have endangered not just me, but her and my little brother. I glanced at her quickly, her face still set in a defiant glare. "Pull over," I said, my voice firm and controlled, though I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "What?" she snapped, crossing her arms. "You're being ridiculous." "No," I said, my voice louder now, my frustration spilling out. "You slapped me, Mom, while I was driving. Do you even realize how dangerous that was? I could have crashed." Her face didn't soften. If anything, she looked more indignant. "You're overreacting. It wasn't that serious. You need to learn some respect." Respect. The word hit me like a punch. I'd been trying to keep everyone safe, trying to navigate through her vague instructions, and she thought I was the one being disrespectful. I shook my head, pulling the car toward the side of the road. The tires crunched against the gravel as I brought the car to a stop. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising. My little brother looked up again, confused, his wide eyes flicking between us. "I'm pulling over," I said, turning off the engine. My hands were still gripping the wheel tightly. "I can't drive like this, not when you're acting like this." Her voice turned sharper, louder. "You can't just stop the car. We have things to do. You're acting like a child." I turned to face her, my jaw tight. "You slapped me while I was driving, Mom. That's not okay. Get out of the car." She stared at me, stunned, before her expression hardened again. I could feel the tension crackling between us like a live wire, but I knew I couldn't back down now. The silence that followed my demand was brief but heavy, like the calm before a storm. My mom turned to me, her expression shifting rapidly between disbelief and fury. "You're kicking me out of the car, your own mother." Her voice was sharp, laced with both indignation and challenge. I took a deep breath, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. "Mom, you slapped me while I was driving. You put all of us in danger. I need you to understand how serious that is." She scoffed, throwing her hands up in frustration. "You're being dramatic. It was just a slap. You're acting like I crashed the car myself." My little brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his tablet forgotten. His wide eyes darted between the two of us, unsure of what was happening but clearly sensing the tension. That was the part that hit me the hardest, knowing he was caught in the middle of this. "I can't drive with you in the car right now," I said, my voice shaking slightly but firm. "Not after what you did." She glared at me, her face a mix of anger and disbelief. "Fine," she snapped, yanking the door open. "You want me out? I'll get out. But don't expect me to forget this." My stomach sank as I watched her step out, slamming the door behind her. Then she opened the back door and unbuckled my little brother's seatbelt. "Come on," she said sharply, reaching for his hand. "We're leaving." "Mom, wait," I started, but she was already pulling him out of the car. My little brother looked back at me, his expression confused and scared, but he didn't resist. I felt an overwhelming wave of guilt crash over me as I watched them start walking down the side of the road. I sat there for a moment, frozen. The anger that had driven my actions moments ago was quickly being replaced by a sinking sense of regret. Had I gone too far? Should I have handled it differently? The weight of the situation pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, my heart pounding as I watched them walk away. My mom's steps were fast and deliberate, her body language radiating anger. My little brother, on the other hand, stumbled to keep up, his tiny legs struggling to match her pace. He kept glancing back at me, his confused eyes meeting mine through the rearview mirror. A knot tightened in my stomach. The weight of what had just happened hit me like a brick. I had never imagined it would come to this, pulling over, telling my mom to get out, and now watching her walk down the side of the road with my little brother in tow. It felt surreal, almost like I was outside of my own body watching this unfold. For a moment I debated getting out of the car, running after them and apologizing, but then I thought about the slap, the danger it had caused, and the principle of the matter. She had crossed a line, one that I felt needed to be addressed. Yet as I sat there, the anger that had fueled my decision began to fade, leaving only doubt and a gnawing sense of guilt. The road ahead was quiet, the occasional car speeding past without slowing down. I could see them getting smaller and smaller in the distance, my little brother's small figure clutching my mom's hand as they walked. Each step they took seemed to amplify the silence in the car. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. Had I done the right thing? Was this the only way to make her understand how serious the situation was? Or had I let my emotions get the better of me, creating a scene that could have been avoided? The questions swirled unanswered as I sat there frozen in place. The car felt eerily still as I sat there, staring at the empty stretch of road ahead. My breathing was uneven, the adrenaline from the argument still coursing through me. I kept replaying the slap in my mind, the sharp sting, the jolt, the way the car had briefly swerved. It wasn't just the physical act that stayed with me, it was the deeper sense of betrayal, the lack of care for the situation's seriousness. But now, as the initial heat of the moment began to subside, the weight of my decision started to settle in. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, but they were gone, completely out of sight. My little brother's empty car seat loomed behind me, a quiet reminder of the unintended collateral damage in this whole mess. I leaned back, resting my head against the seat, and closed my eyes for a moment. The anger that had driven me to pull over was gone, replaced by a heavy mixture of regret and uncertainty. Was there a better way I could have handled it? Could I have kept my cool long enough to diffuse the situation without pulling over? The image of my little brother's face kept flashing in my mind, his wide, confused eyes as he looked back at me, his small hand clutching my mom's as they walked away. He didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this, and I hated that he had been. I sat there, torn. Part of me wanted to turn the key, drive off, and leave the mess behind me. But the other part, the louder part, knew I couldn't leave things like this. I couldn't let this be the ending. Taking a deep breath, I made my decision. I had to go back. I started the car, the engine roaring to life as if it shared my urgency. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the steering wheel, pulling back onto the road. The guilt had grown too heavy to ignore. Leaving my mom and little brother on the side of the road wasn't something I could live with, no matter how justified I felt in the moment. As I drove, I tried to sort through my emotions, but it felt impossible. Anger, regret, frustration, they were all tangled together, competing for my attention. My mind kept circling back to my little brother. He hadn't asked to be part of this argument, yet he was stuck in the middle of it, forced to leave the car and walk alongside my mom. I scanned the road ahead, looking for any sign of them. The quiet hum of the tires against the asphalt filled the silence in the car, a constant reminder of how empty it felt without their presence. My heart pounded harder as I thought about what I'd say when I found them. Would my mom even get back in the car? She'd been furious when I pulled over, and I knew her pride might keep her walking even if I apologized. But I couldn't let my worry stop me. I had to make things right, or at least try. As I rounded a bend in the road, I spotted them in the distance. My mom's figure was unmistakable, her strides firm and determined. My little brother lagged slightly behind, holding her hand but occasionally looking around, probably bored or tired. I slowed the car, my palms sweaty against the steering wheel. The closer I got, the heavier the weight in my chest became. It was time to face them, and whatever came next. I pulled up slowly, the car crunching against the gravel as I approached them. My mum didn't stop walking, not at first. She glanced over her shoulder, saw me, and kept moving as if I weren't there. My little brother, however, noticed immediately. His face lit up for a brief moment, but when he looked up at her, he hesitated, unsure if he should react. I rolled down the window and leaned slightly toward her. "Mom," I said, my voice softer now, almost pleading. "Get in the car, let's just get home." She stopped walking but didn't turn to face me. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders set in that familiar way that told me she wasn't ready to let this go. You think you can just order me out of the car and then pick me up like nothing happened? She snapped, her voice cold but quieter than before. I sighed, resting my head briefly against the steering wheel before looking back at her. I'm sorry, I said, the words heavier than I expected. I shouldn't have made you get out, but you slapped me while I was driving, Mom. That wasn't okay. She finally turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment we just stared at each other, the tension between us hanging thick in the air. My little brother tugged gently at her hand, breaking the silence. Mommy, I'm tired, he said softly, his voice small but insistent. That seemed to break through her resolve. She sighed heavily and opened the back door, helping my little brother back into his seat. She climbed into the passenger side without a word, slamming the door shut harder than necessary. The silence in the car was suffocating as I pulled back onto the road. No one said a word, not even my little brother, who had gone back to his tablet, though his usual cheer was noticeably dimmer. I focused on driving, the weight of the unresolved tension pressing down on me. Every mile felt heavier than the last, and I knew this was far from over. The drive back home was suffocatingly quiet. My mom stared out the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. My little brother had his tablet in his lap, but he wasn't humming or tapping his feet like he usually did. Instead, he just sat there, glancing up at us occasionally as if waiting for someone to say something. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The weight of what had happened hung heavily in the car, unspoken but undeniable. Every glance at the rearview mirror reminded me of my little brother's innocent face, caught in the middle of a situation he didn't understand. When we pulled into the driveway, my mom opened her door before the car had even come to a full stop. She grabbed her purse and stepped out, not saying a word. My little brother hesitated, looking between me and her before finally following her out of the car. Thanks for the ride, my mom said flatly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. She didn't wait for a response. With my little brother trailing behind her, she headed toward the house, leaving me sitting there alone in the car. I turned off the engine and leaned back in the seat, staring at the ceiling. The house loomed in front of me, quiet and still, but it felt as though the argument was echoing in its walls already. I knew going inside would mean facing the fallout, but I wasn't ready to move just yet. I stayed there for a while, the silence pressing down on me, trying to figure out how everything had spiraled so quickly. Part of me wanted to apologize again, to smooth things over, but another part still felt justified. I didn't know how to reconcile the two. Sitting in the car, I felt the weight of the day pressing down on me. My chest felt tight, my thoughts racing in circles. The slap, pulling over, watching them walk away. It all replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't shut off. Every detail felt sharper now, every decision heavier. Eventually, I forced myself to get out of the car. The late afternoon air was cool, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. As I walked toward the house, I saw the curtain shift slightly in the living room window. My mum must have noticed me coming, but she didn't open the door or say anything. It felt like a barrier, not just physical, but emotional, and I wasn't sure how to cross it. Inside, the house was quiet. My little brother was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his tablet. He glanced up at me when I walked in but didn't say a word. His usual bubbly energy was gone, replaced by a kind of stillness that didn't sit right with me. I wanted to say something to him, to let him know everything was okay, but the words wouldn't come. I moved toward the kitchen, hoping to find my mom, but she wasn't there. The faint sound of a door closing upstairs told me she'd gone to her room. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, the silence around me almost deafening. For a moment I thought about going upstairs, about knocking on her door and trying to talk. But the tension from earlier still felt raw, like a wound that hadn't had time to scab over. I didn't know if either of us was ready for that conversation. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, my head in my hands. The enormity of the day was settling in now, and for the first time I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it. The anger, the regret, the doubt. It all swirled together, leaving me exhausted and unsure of what to do next. Sitting at the kitchen table, I felt the silence around me stretch, heavy and oppressive. My thoughts were a whirlwind, colliding and crashing into each other. I kept replaying everything: her slap, my reaction, pulling over, her walking away with my little brother. Every moment felt etched into my mind, each one heavier than the last. Was I wrong? The question gnawed at me, relentless and unyielding. I had acted out of anger, but wasn't it justified? She slapped me while I was driving, putting all of us at risk. That wasn't something I could just ignore, yet my response, pulling over and kicking her out, now seemed harsh, especially with my little brother involved. I tried to justify it to myself. She needed to see that what she did was unacceptable. But another part of me whispered that there might have been a better way, a calmer way to handle things. My frustration hadn't just been about the slap. It had been building for years, fueled by all the small conflicts and unresolved tensions between us. The slap was just the breaking point. I glanced toward the living room. My little brother was still sitting on the floor, quietly tapping at his tablet. He didn't look upset, but the way he had watched us during the argument haunted me. What kind of example had I set for him? He deserved better than to be caught in the middle of our mess. The weight of regret pressed harder on my chest. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, unsure of how to move forward. Should I apologize? Stand my ground? Try to explain myself? No answer felt entirely right, and the uncertainty only added to the turmoil inside me. All I knew was that things couldn't stay like this. Something had to give, but I wasn't sure what or how. As I sat there staring at the empty kitchen, I tried to shift my focus to my mom's side of the story. It wasn't easy. My mind was still clouded by my own frustration and guilt, but I knew I couldn't move forward without at least trying to understand her perspective. My mom had always been strong-willed, the kind of person who demanded respect, but didn't always see how her actions affected others. To her, the slap might have been a moment of frustration, an instinctive reaction in the heat of the argument. Maybe she didn't think it was a big deal, just a way to express her anger in the moment. But that didn't change the fact that it had crossed a line. For me, it wasn't just about the slap. It was about the lack of regard for how dangerous it was. Did she realize that it had scared me? That it could have put all of us in serious danger? Or did she see my reaction as a personal attack, a disrespectful overstep that hurt her pride? I thought about her taking my little brother out of the car. Maybe that was her way of regaining control in a situation where she felt powerless. Or maybe she genuinely thought I was out of line and needed to show me that she wouldn't tolerate it. Either way, I could see how my actions might have felt extreme to her. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that her refusal to acknowledge what she'd done was part of the problem. How could we move past this if she didn't see why it had upset me so much? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about today. It was about the years of misunderstandings and unspoken frustrations between us. This was just the moment when everything boiled over. I looked toward the living room again, where my little brother sat quietly, his tablet screen reflecting off his wide eyes. His small presence in the middle of such a tense day felt heavier now than it had during the actual argument. He hadn't said much, hadn't cried or protested, but that didn't mean he wasn't affected. He was only 5, but kids pick up on more than adults often realize. I thought back to the moment my mum pulled him out of the car. He didn't resist her, didn't ask why. They both just left without a word. Yet the look he gave me as they walked away had stayed with me. Confusion, uncertainty, maybe even fear. At the time, I was too caught up in my emotions to really process it. Now that look haunted me. What kind of memory had we created for him today? I hated the idea that he might grow up and remember this as one of those defining family moments, his mom yelling, his older brother losing control, and him stuck in the middle, trying to figure out what it all meant. I wondered if he'd already started piecing together his own narrative. Did he think I was wrong? Did he think Mom was? Or was he too young to fully understand, just feeling the weight of the tension without knowing where it came from? The thought made my chest ache. He deserved better than this. I had always felt a sense of responsibility for him, not just as his big brother, but as someone he could look up to. Today, I hadn't been that person. I'd let my anger take over, and in doing so, I'd failed him. Whatever I decided to do next, it wasn't just about me or Mom anymore. It was about him, too. As the day replayed itself in my mind yet again, one thought stood out above the rest. The slap wasn't just an act of frustration, it was a boundary that had been crossed. I tried to imagine what might have happened if I'd swerved harder, if there had been a car in the next lane, or if I hadn't been able to regain control quickly. The consequences could have been catastrophic, and that realization weighed heavily on me. It wasn't about the slap itself anymore. It was about what it represented, a lack of awareness for how dangerous the situation had been. I didn't think my mom had meant to put us in harm's way. She acted in the heat of the moment, and maybe, to her, it wasn't a big deal. But the fact that she didn't seem to grasp the severity of it, even after I pulled over, was what made it so hard to move past. At the same time, I started questioning myself. Was I wrong for demanding she leave the car? Could I have made my point another way, one that didn't escalate the situation and involve my little brother? Kicking her out might have felt justified in the moment, but now it felt reactionary, like I'd let my anger control me instead of thinking clearly. I thought about the kind of boundaries we set within families, what's acceptable, what's not, and how we enforce those lines. My mom was the parent, the authority figure, but I was the one behind the wheel. In that moment, I had felt responsible for everyone's safety, but I also felt powerless. The slap was her way of asserting control, and pulling over was mine. But boundaries aren't just about control, they're about respect. Respect for safety, for emotions, and for each other. That's where things had fallen apart. We'd both let our emotions take over, and in doing so, we'd crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed. I needed her to see that, but I wasn't sure how to make her understand without things spiraling all over again. Sitting there, still lost in thought, the doubt began to creep in more insistently. The slap had been wrong, I was sure of that. But had I overreacted? Was kicking my mom out of the car truly the best way to handle it? In the moment, it felt like the only way to make her understand how serious it was, but now I wasn't so sure. I replayed the moment I pulled over, the sharp sound of the tires against the gravel, her look of shock turning to anger. I thought about her words, the way she accused me of being disrespectful, of making a scene. She'd clearly felt blindsided, but had I taken it too far? Could I have stayed calm and still gotten my point across? My little brother's face flashed in my mind again, that look of confusion and worry as he climbed out of the car. He hadn't said anything, but his silence was louder than words. He probably didn't understand why I acted the way I did, or why Mom had reacted the way she did. To him, it must have felt chaotic and unsettling, a situation he couldn't make sense of. I sighed, my head in my hands. I didn't regret standing up for myself, but I regretted how I did it. Maybe pulling over had been the wrong choice. Maybe raising my voice had only escalated things further. But what else could I have done? Let her slap me and keep driving like nothing had happened. That didn't feel right either. The more I thought about it, the more tangled it became. I wanted to be justified, but I also wanted peace. And in that moment, I couldn't see a clear path that led to both. The guilt and frustration churned in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. As I sit here now, replaying everything, I can't shake the feeling that I might have handled it wrong. Or maybe I didn't. I don't know. That's why I'm telling this story. Not to defend myself or to make my mom look bad, but because I genuinely don't know if I was in the wrong. When she slapped me, I felt blindsided. Like my role as the driver, the person responsible for everyone's safety, had been completely disregarded. I could have swerved into another car or off the road entirely. The slap felt bigger than just a reaction to frustration. It felt dangerous. I wanted her to realize that, to understand that her actions weren't okay. But did pulling over and kicking her out of the car go too far? Did I escalate things instead of de-escalating them? I keep coming back to my little brother. He was in the car, sitting in the middle of all this tension, caught between me and my mum. That's the part that hurts the most. He didn't deserve to be put in the middle of our fight, and I hate that he had to experience that. Was I wrong to act so strongly, knowing he was there? Should I have let it go, at least in that moment, for his sake? At the same time, I don't think it's fair to say I should have just swallowed it and kept driving. That slap crossed a line, and I believe it was important to make that clear. But how do you draw a boundary without crossing one yourself? That's where I'm stuck. So now I'm here laying it all out for you. Did I overreact? Was pulling over and telling her to get out of the car too extreme? Or was it a reasonable response to an unreasonable action? I'm not sure anymore, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Am I wrong, or am I just someone who made a messy decision in a messy moment? You tell me.